Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by and welcome to the final part of the final Project Orchids updates. And this is the turn of the cooler, shadier ones. And if you grow in a structure away from your house, greenhouse, or like me, a conservatory type thing, from experience, I would personally recommend that if you're going to grow cooler ones and dedicate yourself to those sort of things, which a lot in the UK have done, simply because it's a lot cheaper to run a cooler outside structure than it is a hot one. The heating costs go down, yeah? So, and they'll take the lower temperatures. Obviously in the summer, when the sun gets on the structure, it's going to get too warm for them. So you've got to cater for that. And my basic principles in here are intermediate. So my cooler, shadier ones are not at their best. They do well in the autumn, winter and early spring. But once the old summer comes round, it's too warm for them. But I do my best with them because I like them. And I have got a few up the top end of intermediate that would almost be classed as warm. They don't like the winter time. So you have to get a balance of plants that suit your temperature range. And I think quite honestly, when you start building a collection, selecting that temperature range is quite important at the beginning. Yeah, if you set your temperature range and you know you can maintain it and it's going to be okay, then you can select the plants that will do well. As I say, my cooler, shadier ones certainly don't like the summer in here. You know, I mean, I've been up to 32, 33, and they'd do better if they never went above 24, you know, or even slightly lower. But they don't mind getting cooler in the winter. So anyway, this will be the final part 4. So let's get going. Okay, so first up is this Masdevallia hybrid Copperwing. Got because I like the blooms basically, but I can't for the life of me remember where I got it from. But at the time I got it, it was in an open basket. It was a new plant in December 2018. I got it in November, so I hadn't had it long, bought in bloom. But it was in an open basket in bark, which for a Masdevallia is not exactly ideal. So obviously the first thought was, how am I going to keep this? What am I going to pot it in? Is it going to stay in the basket? All that sort of thing. But it didn't look a bad plant, although not many leaves. By the time we got to February, I'd made my mind up that it was going to go in live moss. So it had been repotted, and it was starting to show signs of new growth. So it took to its repot reasonably well. I won't say very well. It didn't have very good roots basically. And by the time we got to May, I was starting to get a little worried that I'd potted it far too low in the basket and its root run was too shallow. And in addition to that, because of the heat wave we were going, it was drying incredibly fast. So I had to do something about that. But the plant was still okay. And by the time we got to September, you can see I'd repotted it much deeper, and again we still had some new growths pushing out. No sign of blooms. All I was interested in really at this point was getting a decent set of roots on the thing, because it didn't have many at all. Well, quite honestly, the little Masdevallia isn't doing much, but what it's stopped doing is dropping older leaves, which are good. We've got several new growths coming. This is the largest of the newer growths pushing on. So it's hanging in there. I suspect it's still yet to put out a decent root system, but I'm not taking it out to find out. So it's progressing, I suppose, but it's incredibly slow to get going. It's just taking a long time to get a hold. I mean, when I first got a few Masdevallias in, I had one that actually took 2 years before it grew any roots or a new leaf. It just sat there doing absolutely nothing. And some of them do just take a while to get going. And providing they live while they're waiting to get going, they will normally pull on eventually. But this one's just very slow to progress at the moment. Okay, next on the list is a Miltonia hybrid that I got in about April 2018 as a gift, because I'd been whining for a long time about not being able to find a yellow Miltoniopsis. So somebody gave me one, which was greatly appreciated. It didn't look a bad plant. It was a division off a large plant. And in December we had some new roots, showing signs of new roots. We had a strong new growth pushing up, maybe two, I can't remember. But the plant was looking quite good, and I was seriously looking forward to see what these blooms looked like, because although I was told it was yellow, I had no idea. So it was just a matter of patiently waiting, like we do. And by the time we got to February, the plant was still looking good. And new roots had progressed a little, not as fast as I'd have liked, but nonetheless the plant was doing okay, leaves looked in good condition, plant looked healthy. So I was still looking forward to blooms. And by the time we got to May, we got them, and were they stunning? Absolutely over the moon. And basically, that wasn't a bad spike for a division for its first time blooming. I was well pleased, absolutely chuffed to bits, until we got to December and September, and during that period the whole plant just collapsed. Some rot set in near the base, and basically it became non-recoverable, so it became ceased to be. It is no longer with us. Next up, Dracula Bella. I got this at Burnham's in July 2018. I think it may have been my first ever Dracula, because I'd seen a bloom at a show, and I thought, well, if I'm going to give a Dracula a try, let's go for a good one. So I paid quite a lot of money for this at Burnham's. Even Sarah was surprised at the price. Nonetheless, it didn't look a bad plant. Had signs of new growth. Roots weren't too bad. And I decided, being a Dracula, it pushes its spikes downwards, so it's got to go in an open basket. So at the time I thought that basket's plenty big enough for a Dracula. They don't tend to grow absolutely huge. And I was starting off with what I considered quite a good plant. So that progressed. By the time we got to February, we were starting to push out spikes, and I was over the moon. And we managed to get it to bloom, hence the picture of the bloom. It was around that time, late winter, early spring. And I was pleased it was pushing spikes and growing new growths. And it continued to push out spikes and push up new growths all the way through the summer, and every single one of the spikes blasted. I just think it couldn't cope with the heat, and possibly my letting it dry a bit too much in between waterings. It could have been a bit of me as well, but it didn't like the heat. It wouldn't bloom. And by the time we got to September, you can see now the spikes on that plant, the buds have already turned brown. It just would not bloom. It was annoying because it was pushing out spikes all the time and just would not finish them off and bloom. So let's see where we are now. The first thing that's obvious with the Dracula Bella is just how big this plant has got. Some of the newer leaves that it's produced are 2 or 3 inches longer than anything it had before. So it's growing incredibly well, and it's still doing it. I mean, if you take this as a new growth, it's quite a bit longer than the others. Yeah, and there are many of them, and it's still producing more. So the plant is growing incredibly well. But the important thing is that as we've gone into winter, the latest set of spikes do look like they're going to bloom. None of the buds back in the summer got anywhere near this far before they went brown and fell off. So we've got 3 to come. I would imagine if these 3 successfully bloom, they may even be open at the same time. But I also suspect if they do, the plant will have a bit of a rest from blooming, because I don't see any more spikes coming at the moment. It's just those 3. Now there's no new ones forming at the moment, so if it does bloom on those 3, that'll be wonderful. but I suspect it'll take a bit of a rest then. It's pushed out a lot of new growths over this season. I'm very well pleased with the plant, especially some of the size of the leaves. So yeah, I think that was my first venture into the Dracula world, and I didn't realise the plant was going to get that big, I must admit. I knew the blooms were big because as I originally saw it at a show, I thought, well, if we're going to give it a go, we'll give it a go with that one. So at the moment, doing very well, well pleased. Next on the list was a little Restrepia. This was got from Peter White in 2017 at the Wessex Orchid Society's autumn show, so that would have been October time, I presume. And I got two. They originated from the Eric Young Foundation. They were their own hybrids, and those don't come out to play very often, and Peter White had a good selection, so I thought we'll have a couple of these, simply because they're difficult to ever find for sale. Anyway, I'd got what I thought was a reasonable sized plant for a Restrepia. I've bought far smaller ones than that before, so I was pleased with the plant, very pleased with what I paid for it, which was next to nothing. So that was the sort of start point. By the time we got to February, it had started to bloom, but we did have a few problems when it was repotted. It wasn't hydrating properly, hence the crinkled leaves on the top right. You can see if they don't get enough humidity and hydration, they will get deformed leaves. That's your telltale sign, basically. So through the summer on into May, we were now in the middle of a heat wave, and so new growths were continuing to grow with the distorted leaves. Some of the older leaves were also starting to fade, which was a trifle worrying at the time. By the time we got to September, we were starting to get a few growths that were pushing out leaves that weren't distorted, so obviously it was establishing a decent root system. Took a while though, and suffered from too much light like many other of my plants. So let's see what that looks like today. And today the little Restrepia is actually slowly getting better. The old distorted leaves that it pushed out when it didn't have a good root system are actually blooming, so it does actually have a bloom on it at the moment. As Restrepia's blooms go, these are quite a reasonable size. I don't know how close I can get before it goes out of focus, but very attractive blooms, and it is currently blooming in several places. Some have dropped off, but it's pushing out blooms on and off as they do. But the good thing is that the latest leaves pushing up seem to be keeping their shape. This one over here as well. So hopefully that's the end of the distorted leaves, and it'll certainly be the end of the too much light saga. These should not go that colour. They shouldn't be getting the amount of light that can actually turn them purple. In fact, they should be quite a sort of mid-green, almost mid towards deep green. They shouldn't be getting purple tinges. That will be dealt with, obviously. Be difficult for them to get too much light this time of year, but next year we will try and get this one growing a bit better perhaps. But what we need is more new leaves, and just literally more leaves, because it's got very few for the base of the plant. We've got some roots on it now, and it is blooming, so slow progress for me for a Restrepia, but nonetheless progress. And the Paphiopedilum I chose for the project plants was Maudiae. It was my only Paph that effectively had two growths, and that's what it had done since I got it. I had this plant a long time, got it in November 2015. It always had two growths, they always both bloomed, and then they produced two new growths and the older ones just died off, so I could never manage to get a nice big bushy plant like some people do. And again, that could possibly be my conditions and the fact that I used to repot far too infrequently. These like fresh media. So anyway, back in December 2018 we had the two plants in they were joined, they weren't separate plants, and we had a bud forming. So it wasn't quite behaving as normal this time because it only had one bud. So by the time we got to February, we now had our one in bloom. We'd lost some leaves, and one of the plants was starting to get that rusty coloured patching on the leaves. So I was a bit worried about one, but the other looked healthy and looked green, and well, looked how it was supposed to. By the time we got to May, I decided to repot, and I split the two plants on the grounds that it wanted to do that anyway. It practically fell apart rather than me actually separating it. So during May we'd finished our blooms, and we now had two plants in fresh media. By the time we got to September, nothing much had changed, but I did have some reasonable roots growing in the pot, so it looked like they'd taken to their repot and their fresh media, and I was quite pleased. I probably wasn't going to keep both of them. So on to today. The Paphiopedilum Maudiae, where there were two, there are now one. One of them was put aside to go to somebody else, and as I was going over them with my daughter, she said, "That's got those brown rusty patches on those leaves. You can't send that to somebody else and give it to their other plants." So snap decision there and then, it went in the bin. So we're down to one, which I'm prepared to keep as long as it behaves itself. It's currently got a bud swelling up nicely. Probably it'll be open in the within a couple of weeks, I should think, but basically Paphiopedilums are just relatively slow compared with other orchids, which are rather slow anyway in many cases. So whatever it does, it's going to take its time. But this one I like because of its simplicity. It's just two colours, green and white, and it looks really nice, and we'll see it in the not too distant future. And then once the bloom's over, it'll push up a new growth, and as that new growth pushes on, I suspect the old one will die, because that's what it seems to do for me. Maybe this one will hang in there and give the plant some strength, because as long as it only grows one growth at a time, it's never going to turn into a big strong plant and ever have more than one bloom at a time. So we'll see what we can do with it. I think we've got a reasonable root system on it, somewhere buried in there. Yeah, we got good roots on it, so it's, you know, it has some strength underneath it, so maybe it can hold on to this growth while it pushes a new one up. We shall see. And the last one is this little mini Phalaenopsis that somebody else found the name for this. I just had it down as hybrid, but Sogo Gotris apparently, and the picture did match exactly, plus the plant size, so I was happy that it was named correctly. I decided to mount this, and of course it was hanging down originally. That's the bottom two leaves pointing downwards, not natural at all, but the next two leaves it grew were up the right way, so it was starting to sort of take shape. It didn't have a bad root system on the mount, although not many of those roots were actually attached. But nonetheless it was hydrating okay. It had a spike pushing up topwards and an old spike out to the left, which I had trimmed to see if it would branch. No sign of new leaves, but nonetheless it seemed to be doing okay mounted. So I hadn't long tried a couple of Phalaenopsis on mount, so I wasn't quite sure how they were going to take to it. By the time we got to February, we had buds forming on the top spike, one sticking upwards, and the bottom spike was showing signs of branching. The roots had progressed a bit, but not a lot, but no sign of new leaves. So by the time we got to May, we were in the warmth now, and our buds had started to open. The spike had a couple of blooms on. They are very attractive blooms. I was well pleased. For such a tiny little plant, they're not a bad size. I'd attached some of the dangly roots to see if they would actually attach. By the time we got to September, blooms had gone, spikes had been left on, but we were coming back into vegetative growth, so new roots were pushing out, and there was the start of some new leaves. So let's see where we are today. Well, quite honestly, this little mounted mini Phalaenopsis hasn't actually done a lot since we last saw it, but you have to bear in mind in September we had some new leaves growing and it's promptly gone into winter. So it's too cold for this to be in its ideal world at the moment. It did produce, while it decided to do some vegetative growth, it did produce quite a few new roots. So there is now quite a good root system on here. Some have gone right round the back of the mount. There's some active growing tips on some of the roots. So it is in active growth, but what was a little sad is the two new leaves did not get any size to them. Now that could be me, it could be being underfed. Plus, in addition to that, once Phalaenopsis get into vegetative growth, they need a constant supply of hydration and nutrients, or they just stall. They got no storage organs, they got nowhere to keep anything, so you have to keep it coming, and that's probably its demise, because this gets watered with my other mounts, and this time of year they don't get watered so often because a hell of a lot of them are dendrobiums and they don't need it. They're supposed to be drier in winter, so this is suffering a bit at the moment. The first leaf to come out was the one on the left, top one I mean, and the second one was the one on the right that does actually look as though it's still growing a bit. I don't think they're going to get up to full size though. Well, certainly not the way it's getting treated at the moment, and I can't be knocking up feed specific for one or two plants. It has to have what the rest get. If it doesn't like it, tough. Spikes are off. I took those off to give it a chance to have a rest from blooming and produce some new roots and some leaves. So that's as far as we've got with that. That's the last one as well. Okay, so that's the last of that set of Project Orchids. That's 2018 December through to December 2019, a year's worth of progress, and I hope you've enjoyed the set. As far as next year is concerned, I've got a completely new set of Project Orchids. I'm going to do the same thing again. The only difference is, instead of starting in December, I'll be starting in March, which logically is a bit of a better time to start because it's the start of the growing season. But nonetheless, you know, the updates will still end up with a winter update when they're probably sat there doing very little. So, hope you've enjoyed that set of Project Orchids, partly selected by viewers, partly selected by me. And again, the next set of Project Orchids is a bit of a mixture. Totally different set of plants. I think there's only maybe one or two that I've kept going, so they'll get like 2 years worth. But apart from that, as far as this type of video is concerned, I'll revisit it at the start of the season in March. So, see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.